So we're now on item 18. If I can call the meeting to order, please. Thank you. Okay, so item 18, the Cranford Regeneration Area, infrastructure funding. Now we've got an alternative resolution on the screen which was circulated by email prior to the meeting. This is different than the staff recommendation which is in the agenda. I'm assuming in as much as this has been put forward, somebody would be willing to move it when we get there?
I think the staff are going to speak to it first.
Okay, so let's proceed on that basis. So, yeah, any comments from staff, including some commentary on this resolution that we've got in front of us? Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon, Mayor and Councillors. The choice today is quite straightforward when you boil it down. On the one hand, you've got the staff recommendation, which is, as per the regeneration plan, that the private developers and landowners fund the internal infrastructure that's needed to implement this plan. So that's what the officers have put forward in the agenda. The option is for the council to intervene in some way to expedite development in a way which will help implement the plan. So, on the one hand, I suppose the first option, the one that we've got on the agenda, is financially based. It is a prudent recommendation which has little risk to the council. It doesn't involve the council financially being involved in this particular development. The downside of that is that the development or the implementation of this regeneration plan will rely on the market to implement it whenever that may be. So what the alternative recommendation does, it says, well, it's unlikely that this plan will be implemented in an expedited manner as what was anticipated under the Regeneration Act. So if the council does want to intervene in some way, then it could provide some certainty to landowners for them to go away and do what is a very important geohydrological study of the groundwater resource in this particular area. And if they spend the money on that, then the council, in principle, will consider, will look at options for front-loading some or all of the infrastructure on a cost recovery basis. So that's basically what the choice is, and that's why I understand that that alternative recommendation has been put forward, so that it provides it would provide some comfort to the landowners that they would not be going ahead and spending $100,000 odd and then nothing else happens. So that's basically where it is, I think.
Thank you. Pauline.
Just a question. Is it a common occurrence that the council does this front funding of infrastructure? Or is this a precedent?
Two questions there. The first one, the answer, it is quite common where there is fragmented land ownership. It is often difficult for landowners to combine together and to implement an ODP without someone stepping into the breach and providing some of that key infrastructure. In the past, that's been around our planned areas, though. That's the Southwest Area Plan, the Belfast Area Plan, where the council has itself promoted development, and so it's made sure that LTP has supported that. In some areas it hasn't, and it's left to the landowners, particularly if there's only a single landowner where they go ahead and do it themselves. So it's a bit of both. Yeah, so it's not unusual. In terms of precedent, I'm aware of one or two other areas of the city that might be looking for the council to support their developments and could see this as a precedent, but bearing in mind this has gone through a separate process. It's gone through the Regeneration Act. The expectation of the minister of the time was that this plan the plan would be expedited and development would be expedited. And so there is probably little risk of a precedent from that point of view.
Thank you. Tim.
You mentioned before about the landowners, would go and do testing on the land, hydrology testing, etc., and that this would soften the blow. But they'd have to do that anyway, wouldn't they?
They've got to do that anyway before they lodge it as part of their subdivision consent.
Okay, so second question, I've got three. Second question is, who put the second option forward with regards to council putting funding forward?
It was asked of the officers to, if the council were of a mind to intervene, then what would such a recommendation look like without committing a future council to funding it, but enough to give some comfort to landowners?
So I'm going to have 4 questions now. So if, for instance, we put funding forward, they do the testing and it turns out it's not going to work, we've lost the money.
No, not if, no.
We've agreed to put money forward because they're spending money on the testing.
No, it's subject to the council accepting the geohydrological plan, and it can't do anything until that plan's done, because it needs to understand what is feasible on that land. Now, the ODP, which is in the Cranford Regeneration Plan, was based on the best information we have about the hydrogeology, about the water issues, about a number of things. Now, the investigations were reasonably detailed, but it's not until you get down into doing some serious study on groundwater in particular that you get a good idea as to what is actually feasible. So it may well be that that ODP could change as a result of that study, and I don't think the council should commit anything until that's done.
Okay. Final question is, we're under pressure with rates, so where's this money, which is unplanned, going to come from?
My understanding would either come out, be part of a new budget, or else, I think Brian's sitting behind me somewhere, it would be...
Yeah.
It would involve some change to the Styx River management, stormwater management plan, I think, but Brian will need to.
What?
Yeah, but it would be recovered. Well, the risk is at the end of the day, it shouldn't cost the council anything other than the holding costs until the land is developed. The risk to the council of putting money in here is that development takes some time to take off, in which case the council has invested principal and interest, which goes back to the ratepayer.
However, if we go back to the original, which is, it's up to them to do it, then there's no risk financially to the ratepayers of Christchurch, and it's up to these landowners who are, by principle, developers like any other.
That's correct.
So that leads to a further question. If I compare this to the Akaroa Health Hub work that we did, where we're charging the interest on the funds that we've advanced to them as a part of that arrangement, so it's paid by the recipient of the funds as they pay the funds back to us, in this case by way of a targeted rate. What you're suggesting is that if there's a delay in the development, then the cost of the delay in terms of the additional interest cost in terms of the funds that we advance would be borne by ratepayers as a whole,
yes,
rather than as a part of this development.
Yes.
So that suggests that the interest cost of the advance in general would be borne by ratepayers rather than the developers. Am I reading that correctly? I would have expected that if the advance is for the benefit of these developers, that these developers would be paying all costs in respect of the advance, and that we wouldn't be expecting that to be covered by ratepayers in general.
If the council does offer some kind of funding, then it will need to presumably borrow the money to do it. It will pay, therefore the ratepayer will pay the interest plus the principal repayments over, I understand, over the 30-year period.
So that's the answer. The ratepayer will pay the interest,
yes,
not the developer will pay the interest.
Yeah, well, no, the council would get it back once development proceeds. So until development takes place, I mean, irrespective of the method used, if the development goes swimmingly well and gets done, then either a targeted rate or a DCs or some other agreement, the money will come back to the council. And that and the repayments will take into account the holding cost, the interest and the principal. So it'll end up being cost neutral to the council.
Okay.
The risk is that nothing happens for a while and the council sits there with an asset that it isn't being used.
And I guess if you extrapolate that, there's a risk that the development never takes place, in which case ratepayers do end up picking up the cost.
Yeah, that would be a worst case scenario.
Thank you. Okay.
Just continue on with that any conditions around that repayment and a time frame and an infrastructure development agreement would be part of the next phase. It would have been a report that would come back after the geological, hydrological report.
Yeah, regardless of the
So it's
method
not-
of cost recovery, those additional costs of interest will be factored into the return of funding to the council.
Thank you. Thank you. Yanni.
Sorry? Yeah. You got anything to say, Ron?
Given that we're being asked to make a, in principle, funding decision, and we don't have the specific financial information in front of us, how can we make a decision on this today?
It becomes if I could use a term, almost a political decision really, because from a planning perspective, you can mount a case for the council to allocate funding. From a political perspective, that is a funding decision. You know, it's really up to the council how it spends its money, and that's why the word "in principle" is there, because it just sets, well, in principle, we do this. Then you come back next year and look at more details into what that means once they've done their study. So it provides a small degree of certainty for the landowners to go ahead and do this work. But then the council would need, and I think probably through an infrastructure development agreement of some sort, sit down with the developers and say, well, this is what we're thinking about doing, and that would be up to a different that's a different situation. Right. So it's.
I was just concerned to hear you make reference to some other projects in terms of funding that might be used, for this. And I mean, I don't know. Do we have legal advice around what level of commitment this would give?
Brian may need to answer that.
If people have embarked on work on an expectation that something gets done, then if we decide then that we don't actually want to fund it because we've got other things that are more important, what position does that leave us in?
Yeah. You might want to answer that.
I would envision the funding for a capital project at this location to come out of one of the programs that already exist for stormwater works. The council has a $50-odd million defined projects program for the Styx stormwater management plan implementation, and that sits in a program level which hasn't been assigned to specific projects yet. So it could be that there are projects within that fund that get shifted around and then refunded perhaps in the next LTP. So it would be a matter of, I suppose, reprioritizing the existing program to include a project that wasn't foreseen at the time the last LTP was put together.
Just trying to understand the legality of the decision today without the clear financial information about what's impacted, because for those other communities, maybe there's another project that they actually want, and then they miss out. So, because we go through a draft annual plan to allocate funding. So, is there any way that this could be done to inform our draft annual plan so that we actually get the opportunity to consider all the priorities together?
Yeah, if the if the council made a decision to provide that front load funding and timing allowed it, it could be included in the annual plan. But otherwise, the LTP, as Brian says, has got funding for stormwater that isn't yet allocated to specific projects. So there is, in effect, nobody missing out on something that's already been identified. It's just using a portion of an unallocated but budgeted pot of money to do some work in this area?
Maybe it's a slightly unfair question of staff, but I've got a lot of projects that I'd really like to get done, and if there's unallocated budget, I'd love to attribute some of that to those projects. I'm getting notices of motion rejected for lack of financial information for very small, minor amounts of money, and yet we've got something that's considerable amounts of money that we don't have clear financial on.
It's allocated in as much as it's there for the Styx stormwater program. No.
Well, that board might have a completely different view, but anyway, okay.
It
that's
actually,
cool.
so it's not necessarily Styx catchment, but it exists within the Styx Stormwater Management Plan project area.
Right.
So when they put the Stormwater Management Plan together, they included the Cranford Basin in it so that it could have a program for it.
So are there other projects within that programme of work that if we were going to allocate funds from that programme of work to this project, there are other projects that would not be able to proceed or would cease to be considered in this same time frame?
That's right.
So do we know what those projects are?
The program is often driven by development pressure. So there are projects where there's no development taken place yet. For example, Johns Road near the Otukaikino, there's been no development happening there, even though we do have funding for a stormwater project in that area. So it's projects that could be funded perhaps later in the LTP process that would be replaced by something that was more urgent, such as this project.
And this project aligns with that programme of work?
It would do, yes.
Okay, thank you. Further questions? No further questions. Phil.
I'm asking this particularly because this has come sort of on stream just recently, the alternative recommendations. And Ivan, where you said in terms of precedent, there's probably little risk. But I just wondered if we might be, and I accept, particularly because this is recent, but I just wondered in fact if there's a legal view of that too, in terms of the potential risk. Like, there's always a risk, but just...
Yeah, there are other developments out there that, other developers who could look at this decision and say, yeah, me too. I think from a planning perspective, just leaving aside any legal advice you may want to get, this plan was predicated on what was then seen as urgency by the minister, and it was used the Regeneration Act to expedite development. Now there are no other regeneration plans which do that. So from that perspective, it's on its own. Well, but it doesn't mean to say that someone else may have a go.
Yes.
So the right place to ask a legal question would be to a lawyer. There are two things that have been raised, which sound like questions for lawyers to answer. The first of which is whether we've got enough information in front of us to make this decision. Really, Yanni's question on the funding implication. To make this in-principle decision, and the second is to what degree this might be seen as precedent setting.
In terms of the first one, I think the advice from the end of the table is that the funds are there and can be applied to this particular project. My concern about the supporting in principle is that if you've got other people that are going to go off relying on that decision, and then the council elects not to make the funding commitment further down the track, well then there could be some issues around that. So you need to be reasonably careful about that. In terms of a precedent, again, I'm just picking up from what's coming through at the end of the table, that this is the only recovery plan that we have in this particular state. So there would be grounds for distinguishing this from other similar applications.
Yep. Your answer to the first question is of particular interest, it's fair to say. Thank you. Pauline.
Just a suggestion I think would give me a bit of comfort in B. So we're noting that the amount and timing of any funding and the method and timeliness of cost recovery. I would be quite, because that needs to be considered before a decision is made. So that what the time frame, and that needs to be, in my view, for any agreement to be made after this about actually funding it, would need to be, for me, would have a time frame within that recovery, because that's relevant. So I'd like that included if that's all right.
I'm assuming, are you likely to be moving this?
No.
Okay. So we're crafting an alternative
Voted against it in the
resolution.
first place.
So whose alternative resolution is this?
It's really come from staff.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, to have something on the table.
Okay. Mike's moving.
Okay.
I'm happy to remove the new resolution.
You're happy to move the alternative resolution?
Yes.
That's fine. And is there a seconder for it? Aaron. Okay, great. So just coming back to this question of making an in-principle decision that the developer or landowner may rely on, is there anything that we could do to set that aside? I mean, I guess it's just communication with the landowner as to the fact that this decision is...
We did that with the cathedral.
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of examples of in-principle decisions where things have been read into the in-principle nature of the decision that were perhaps greater than we intended. I mean, maybe that's just something... So from... Presumably staff are in conversation or communication with these developers.
Yes, or a small number of them representing the whole group.
So assuming this was to pass today, how would you communicate the in-principle nature of the decision and how the developer should rely on that or otherwise, what their reaction to it should be? Or what they should take into account as they consider their reaction to it?
Okay, so the first thing that would be communicated would be that irrespective, they need to go and do that further work on the geohydrological plan, which is required by this document. And if that is completed and acceptable to the council and ECAN, then the council will investigate at some later date what the options may be in terms of how those sorts of things. What would the form of cost recovery be? And I imagine it'll be some kind of either memorandum of understanding or development agreement put in place. But they would have to come back to the council, I suspect.
And would you communicate to them clearly, and I think this is important, that there is a possibility, or even maybe a probability, that council, well no, let's say possibility, there is a possibility that council may not choose to do that and may choose, having made this decision in principle, not to progress this further?
Well, staff would follow the decision of council, so the onus is on council to make sure that your decision is both compliant with the LGA, but also, if that's your intention, that you've got that in your decision. So at the moment, your decision says supports in principle, and then 1A is subject to, 1B doesn't appear to be subject to anything. So the staff recommendation in the paper is very clear, and there's alternatives if council didn't want to accept the staff recommendation in the paper, which is that if you want us to look at funding arrangements, we would come back to the new council and we would do that within a matter of months. If this is to be the decision of council, then I think the question of what we would communicate needs to be consistent with the decision of the council, not some other intention that you might have but isn't part of the decision.
So an in-principle resolution such as the one of the in-principle resolution we've got in front of us, just listening to what you've told us, Brendan, suggests that if the conditions are met, that really is, this has been read as the in-principle nature of this decision is subject to the conditions being met, and if their conditions are met, then there would be an expectation that we would proceed with this as if it were a firm decision.
Sure, but the way that I read it, I'm not as clear as where you articulated what those conditions are.
It's more the effect of the words in principle.
Subject to.
Okay, all right. I think people probably need to consider what weight to give to the advice that we've heard. I mean, if people want to ask more questions, then fine.
No, Andrew, I just think that in one, instead of noting that at the end, it should be subject to at the end, A and B. Not noting that, yeah, there.
But that still leaves it as an in-principle decision, subject to, would be my reading of it. But what I've just heard is that if the conditions are met, then it would be considered that that's kind of satisfied the in-principle part of it, and it would be seen as more firm than that.
Let's just get rid of the words in principle.
Supports making funding available,
Subject to.
subject to.
No, I wouldn't support that.
But we can't make a funding decision on the basis of the paper that's in front of us. I think people are going to just need to consider what weight to give to those words in principle and what that actually means. Taking the point around comments that have been made around previous in principle decisions. Let's move back to questions. David.
Just as a matter of clarification, a geohydrological plan, can you just give us a broad outline of what's involved and what sort of likely costs that may, just a ballpark figure? So what does a geohydrological plan involve? First point, and secondly, what's a sort of a ballpark figure of the cost of that activity?
The report would deal with the effects of development on groundwater, springs, and waterways, because the area is affected by springs, seeps, and waterways, and development changes the nature of the ground. We expect that ground remediation will be required in some form or another, whether that be filling or compaction or dynamic compaction, and that those types of works can adversely affect springs and groundwater. The area is also known to contain peat, which is compressible, and adding a load to peat can have effects on groundwater as well. So that's the kind of nature of what the report would contain, is how the land could be developed, or what types of ground remediation would be have less effects on groundwater. The cost, I think somewhere probably between $50,000 and $100,000.
Yeah, well, I think my question was more about the physicality of, what does a geohydrological test involve? What are they actually physically doing?
So it could
Drilling
be
holes or
it could be groundwater monitoring. So it could be monitoring of water levels. It could be CPT testing, so testing of soils. It could be hydraulic conductivity testing. There's a whole variety of types of testing that may need to be done in such a report.
Okay, thank you.
Just following on from that, when I talked about reliance on this decision and what the developer would do next, is what we've just heard, that what they would need to do next would involve expenditure of between $50,000 and $100,000. If you were to put a dollar value on the reliance that the developer would put in this decision in proceeding to this geohydrological plan, the cost of that would be $50,000 to $100,000.
Ballpark, isn't it? Sort of, I don't know, but
Yeah, that's we've done geological testing for subdivision sites, and we've reviewed such reports, and they're somewhere in that range, yes.
So if the future council said this were only a decision in principle and it's not something now that we're willing to support, the reliance on the in principle decision would be between $50,000 and $100,000. Yes, I think that's what we've heard.
yeah.
And just a supplementary, just absolute confirmation, the regeneration plan requires that the subdivision or the landholders conduct this testing.
Yes.
All right, let's
and that's in the district plan as well. And a lot of all these provisions are now in the district plan.
Okay, Thank you.
Okay, let's continue with questions because I'm keen to get some direction on this as we move through it. So Phil, and then back to Tim. Phil.
One question for staff. So this synclinal basin, do we see that as sort of being part of greenfields currently? Is it in that sort of scope?
Yes, it is. The regional policy statement was changed to recognise as a greenfield priority area.
Thanks, Ivan. And my other point is just really a point of process, Mr. Chairman, around the amendment. That's all.
Well, we've got a resolution in front of us, so it's not an amendment. There's a resolution which has been moved and seconded.
So in fact, if that fails, nothing happens.
Well, why don't I, as a matter of process, foreshadow that in the event that this fails, I will move the staff recommendation.
And I would second that.
And there will be a seconder for it. That, as a point of process, it just allows us to move this along. Yeah. All right, thank you. Tim.
How many landowners are involved in this development?
9.
And at the end of this development, how many properties, how many sections or houses would be built with those 9 developments?
There'd be, okay, so there's 99 until the collector road is built, and then potentially there is altogether around about 420.
So the development involves 9 people building over 400 houses, and the sticking point is between $50,000 and $100,000 to kick it off. That's what we're talking.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we're talking. That's exactly what we're talking.
It's the infrastructure cost of the sticking point, and it's basically because one or two of the landowners, one anyway, are not participating in the process as anticipated by the plan. The plan anticipates it all work together and work collaboratively and come up with an internal solution. So that hasn't happened to date.
So what will happen to that single landowner that's not participating? Is they going to wait till it's all done and then be able to develop their land?
Yes, there are. Yeah. That is one outcome. There are other risks that if the council does, for example, collect the money back through DCs, it's still got to acquire the land and go through all the negotiation and valuation around that. So it's a lot of staff time in doing that, so there are risks in that. So it depends on just how cooperative that particular, the landowners are. I don't want to pick on one.
But they are the developers, so that's their situation to sort out, not ours, isn't it? So the issue is they want to develop 420 properties, and the starting point is they want us to front $50,000 to $100,000.
No.
Yeah, no, but
It's the infrastructure, the roading.
Yeah.
There's some.
So that's and then we recover it afterwards.
There's some work going on here around. There are some suggestions been made to some changes to the resolution that's been moved and seconded that may serve to clarify, I think, some of the points that have been touched on there. So, do you want to put this up on the screen? And Mary, do you want to speak to?
So this is just some tweaking of the resolution, which basically saying the same thing but less confusing potentially than your first one, that you're supporting the provision in principle, but that in principle's subject to the two things of landowners working together and the amount and timing being amount of funding and timing of that being finalised at a later point.
I think you need something there to say that the landowners will need to have funding
They'll be funding that, yes.
So the landowners working together and funding that initial graphics beside geohydrological plans, so funded by the landowners. They're not asking us to fund.
How many millions are we talking?
20 million?
Okay, so this is a suggestion as to wording that works better for the reasons that Mary has suggested. Do the mover and seconder want to proceed with this new wording? Aaron, you're happy with that? Mike's nodding. Aaron, you're the seconder. Is that nodding as well? Yeah, great. Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
Say any funding decision, including amount and timing, to be finalised? Because this is not a decision to fund it.
Well, in principle, the provision of...
No, it's not a decision to fund it.
Provides it.
Well, that's the question. Is this a decision to fund it, or is this an in-principle decision to support it, providing these things are put in place and the decision is made by the next council?
Well, that's the exact point, that you need to be very clear in the
Yeah.
decision that you're making. If you're not clear,
Yeah.
then I would suggest that the council wants to take some time to figure out what you want to do.
I mean, what we're trying to do is define the meaning of the words in principle, or the weight that anybody should give to the words in principle.
Yeah, the point that I've made is that you need to know what the triggers are to either go beyond in principle, my advice to you is I'm not clear what the triggers are. The first trigger is relatively clear, that they work together and fund a hydrological assessment, but is the next trigger a council decision, or is it now
Do you want to
good to
Pauline,
go?
do you want to add something?
So
Do you want, that says it comes back to
could
council
say
when everything's
amount and timing
ready to
of
go.
any rates neutral funding.
No.
Can I make a point of order, please?
Okay, yes.
I'm concerned about this process. Like, it's clearly sort of like an add-on, and we're not getting there. We've got other items on our agenda.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a good process at all to make what's
think that's-
potentially a major decision.
I think that's a good point. So the mover and seconder need to... What are we proceeding with? What was originally agreed, or what we've got here now?
It hasn't really changed an awful lot. I'm happy to stick with this. I think it's very clear.
Yeah, I mean, we've got it moved and seconded. It's on the table. We need to make a decision on it.
You do need to clarify who's making the decision and how it's made. So in B, you probably do need to say, you need to at some point say, well, actually, will this come back to council to decide?
Well,
so amount of timing, or
there
is it
seems to be some
staff just
confusion
make
about
that
the
decision?
difference between a decision in principle and a firm decision
I struggle to see,
subject
though,
to
why
certain
when we make
conditions.
other in-principle decisions, it's fine, and then suddenly this one's not.
Can I make a suggestion, just process-wise? This seems to be the motion, the other one is the amendment, which I'm assuming you'll...
The foreshadowed motion, which I've already indicated.
Move it as an amendment, put it first, see if the support for that.
No, we'll run the process that we're on. So,
Can I suggest another process? We've got another meeting on Thursday. Some of us have only just seen these amendments, like, you know, not too long ago. And, you know, I mean, if you want to spend more time on it now, fine. But
I don't think we need to spend more time on it now. There's been plenty of opportunity to answer questions. All I'm doing is to get some firm wording in front of us that we can debate and vote on. And then...
if this is a change to the Cranford Basin Regeneration Plan,
No, it's not.
No, it's not.
is that it says really clearly that that plan requires the developers to fund the infrastructure, not council.
There will be, it's just that we would be doing it,
Andrew,
and then they'd be paid.
All the money's
Why
recovered.
don't you get an indication of support?
So can you just note that?
Well, can we just
wording
do
change?
one thing at a time?
Could you just note the wording change that we're suggesting? So it's very clear where the decision's made. So the amount and timing of any funding and the method and timeliness of cost recovery being considered,
That's a really
will
good,
be considered by council.
yeah.
Yeah.
Follow.
That way it comes back.
And that really does make it an in-principle decision, the way that I would think of an in-principle
we
decision,
can give some
not a
certainty
decision
and
subject to. That actually clarifies that for me.
Right, well, let's move forward now.
Okay, so we've now got, as I understand it, some wording at the bottom of the screen that we can debate. There are no further questions?
Can I just clarify Lane's question?
Yes?
Does this require a change to the Cranford Regeneration?
The answer to that question was no.
Well, can we be very clear on that from the law? Okay, well, I'm just, given that it's very clear in the first resolution that it does require a change, can we actually do that just at the council?
Or do we need for someone to... Is there an answer to this question in the room
Yes,
today?
I think
or do
the
we need to
legal
find it out?
section of the report covers that off. Under section 7, I think it is, in there, where we have got legal, there is a legal advice on this, legal implications. If the council adopts the preferred option of not providing funding that's consistent, if the council uses a mechanism of funding and then recovers the money, then this is largely consistent with the plan.
Okay, so it wouldn't require a change to the regeneration plan?
No.
Covers all the money or just part of the money? The interest, the long, interest over the period,
Interest and principal.
interest and principal
Yes.
over the period of time.
Yes.
So it would be a requirement that any money was actually fully recovered.
That's normal, isn't it?
Yep.
Yep.
All right. No further questions? Okay, so the mover and seconder are comfortable with the wording that we've now got here. So it's what's at the bottom of the screen. Yep. So what we're debating is the wording at the bottom of the screen, so we can get rid of the wording at the top. So now let's move into debate. Is there any debate on this? Yanni.
I worry about this process. You know, I personally have had concerns when we've made in-principle decisions before, because generally what happens is it means that you have to just fulfil that decision, regardless of what comes out at the end. And I just think it places us in a legally risky position. One of the options actually does require a special consultative procedure under the Local Government Act that's referenced in B. I would much rather have a report come back with a development agreement, an infrastructure development agreement with the developers around clear implications about what was going to be delayed in terms of funding and what was going to be the financial impact on rates before agreeing to this. I think that could easily come back to inform our draft annual plan. And so I can't see why we wouldn't be doing that rather than rushing through some amendments now that actually I think raise a huge number of questions around precedent, around consultation, and around what's actually in the regen plan. So, yeah, I understand the need to get development done here, but I also understand that we should actually go through a good process when it comes to our budget, and we need to be consistent around how we apply it. Otherwise, what's the point in going through an annual plan process where we constantly get told we can't make changes and we can't do things, and we don't weigh everything up at the same time?
Phil.
I'm also very concerned about this process of this is like an add-on and let's do it. It just doesn't make sense to do things in a rushed way without actually knowing all of the implications. One thing we do know is that potentially, and that was quite clear from the staff, that in terms of precedent, other developers will be relying on this decision. It's quite major in terms of its follow-through impact, actually. The other thing we learned from another report this morning, the one on the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, is that since 2013, over 50% of new developments have been in existing urban area as part of infill. So that to me raises the question: is what are the how long is this actually going to take before it is developed, and how long do council pay out this money without actually getting any recompense? Now, if we go with the staff's original recommendation, we would be able to find out and look carefully at those things. But with this, accepting it in principle, it's just a process which clearly is going to have implications, which I can never support.
Thank you, Pauline.
Well, I had concerns with this project right from the beginning, and I actually voted against it being made into a regen project because of the challenging hydrogeological features of the area, and my concern was that there would be future costs incurred by council. Now, even though this is a suggestion that council may look at fronting up for infrastructure and roading, but I'm thinking more even ahead of that. If we get more rain events and we find that the capacity is not there, there'll be further costs for future councils. The way I see this is actually when the developers or the landowners read this, they'll go, actually, there's no firm assurance that we're going to be funded. We either bite the bullet and do the geohydrological plan, or we walk away. So I really don't see the point in this. I think I will not be supporting this today and just chuck it back to the landowners if they want to stump up and back their own horse and fund that report. When that report comes back, that's when we look more closely at this, because it may come back that there is no case for building housing in this area.
Thank you. Mike, I'll come to you as the mover at the end. James.
I'll be fast on this. I actually think this is actually a pretty good use of time as a council to go down this path. It's pretty low risk, and our role, if we can oil the wheels, I guess, for positive development to occur with minimal risk to us, then I think that that's a good outcome. So we can do that. We can provide an element of certainty, possibly not as much as we would like, and get things moving in the right direction here. And the costs can come back to us and we get a good outcome. So I think this is the sort of thinking that a council is perfectly placed to do to help get a good outcome from the private sector. So I'm all for it.
Before I come to Mike to close the debate, I'll make a couple. Oh, Glenn.
Thank you. I don't like the look of this. It's kind of like a Trojan horse, taking something, sneaking in, and we're all watching it going in. It's not the way to make a decision. I won't be supporting it.
Yeah, I also share some of the concerns that have been expressed. We've heard about the risk of development proceeding slowly or possibly not at all. We've heard about the precedent-setting element of this. We've also heard that there's what I would consider to be a risk that either the developer would spend 50 to 100,000 on this geohydrological plan, and then we may come back and rely on the in-principle nature of the decision not to then proceed, or that the essence of this wouldn't be effective because it isn't providing the level of certainty that the developer would require to go ahead with the geohydrological plan. So, yeah, I mean, I understand what's attempted to be achieved here, but I think there are a number of risks and process issues that make it a little bit difficult to support, so I won't be supporting it. Mike, I'll come back to you to close the debate.
Thank you. This is obviously a regeneration plan that council put forward and was approved by the minister. This is actually this is a way just to enable it to happen a bit quicker. It doesn't actually have a lot of risk to it. It still requires the landowners to work together and the costs will be recovered. I'm absolutely surprised by Councillor Cotter, who worked with staff to form these resolutions, to suddenly vote against. Maybe she's been told to do that. I'm not too sure.
I want you to retract that, Mike. It's not the case.
Oh,
it's come through
sorry.
questions
I'll retract
and answers
that.
in a
Yeah,
robust...
okay, I'll retract that. But it's just very
you.
interesting to see the debate. So, well, interesting.
All right, thank you for the clarification. Mike, if you want to continue.
Look, this is actually a really good position for development. Close to our city centre, it's on bus routes, it's by bike lanes. It actually, if we can get this thing working, actually it's going to be really good for Christchurch. So I don't know why we as a council would keep putting roadblocks up instead of actually enabling things to happen. So I support this, and I'm actually really surprised why councillors are against this when actually the cost will be recovered. There's unallocated budget already sitting there where this can come from, so why would we be scared not to actually make an in-principle decision where they've still got to go through a few more hurdles to actually even get some money, which isn't going to actually have any new impact on rates because there's budget there.
Can we just call a point of order and get that clarified around what the rates impact, if it will have?
The question
I said new impact is there's budget on LTP.
The question was asked earlier and answered, which was around the potential impact on ratepayers. And what I'm sure we heard was that the only impact on ratepayers was if the development took some time to proceed or didn't proceed at all.
We've got some broad figures on that. Roughly it is about $750,000 per annum for principal and interest, which would gradually reduce over a 30-year period, if nothing happened. So the worst case scenario, that is a broad picture of based on a $10 million loan, or $10 million funding. That's the impact on rates in very broad terms.
But that's only in the event that the development didn't proceed.
That's right. It's the worst
or
case.
Took a long time to proceed.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. That's fine. So we're done with debate. I'll put the motion. So this is the wording that's on the screen. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against? No. And Tim's abstaining. Can we have a show of hands for the noes, please? A division? Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Brooke? No. Councillor Livingston? No. Councillor East?
Yes.
Councillor Clearwater?
No.
Councillor Johansson?
No.
Councillor Scripps is not here. Councillor Templeton? Yes.
Councillor Mungie is not here. Councillor Keown?
Yes, I'm
Councillor Galloway? No. Councillor Chen?
No.
Councillor Davidson?
Yes.
Councillor Cotter? No. Deputy Mayor Turner?
No.
Councillor Scudrick? And Councillor Goff?
Yes.
5 for yes and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 no, 1 absent.
So that's lost. So now we move to the foreshadowed motion, which is the original staff recommendation, which I'd indicated I would move, and Phil, you'd indicated you would second. Is there any need for further debate on this? I'll put the motion. All those in favour?
You're going back to the original.
So this is the staff recommendation as it appears in the paper.
Yeah, so, I mean, I just wanted to signal and check whether we could actually get our staff to work with the developers over an infrastructure development agreement. That could inform our draft annual plan. So we could be really clear about, here's the agreement, here's how it's funded, and that would give, you know, I think some ability for us to consider what the options are. Because personally, I felt there were some good options.
Yes.
I just didn't like the process that we were going through previously.
So I certainly would be happy for you to amend this with that, to put something forward that would amend this with that approach. Phil, would you be happy with that? Yeah.
I'm not close to this to understand the process around it, but you know, given that you've identified some options around that are not inconsistent with the regen plan, that work with the developer around an infrastructure, or developers around an infrastructure development agreement, is that something that you could continue to work towards and bring back a?
Of course, but as I said at the start, there's quite a clear decision. Either the council, sticks with the regeneration plan, or it indicates it's willing to provide some of the upfront funding. If it's willing to do that, then an infrastructure development plan and going through those negotiations is one of the ways to go. I mean, it's to me, it is probably, unless the council is reasonably serious that it's going to support this in some way, then what's to negotiate with an infrastructure development plan?
Because I'm trying to get to a point when we consider our annual plan, the financial implications of doing it with this agreement, so that we can make an informed decision and be fully aware of what the costs are and what the impacts are.
So we would negotiate something without prejudice with the developers, saying, well, here are some options around an agreement of who funds what and when, and then come back with those particular figures.
To inform the draft annual plan.
And you would probably take a steer from this meeting that it would need to have sufficient guarantees in that agreement that this would be rate neutral to the ratepayers of the city. I think for a number of us that was the stumbling block around the previous resolution.
It would also be after a geohydrological.
Well, that would be part of the agreement, I would think.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are a couple of steers that you'd probably take from this meeting, realising that it's going to be a different council that makes the decision on this when it comes back anyway.
So,
all right.
So Andrew, could I just suggest that that the new resolution, so request staff to work with landowners, developers to consider an infrastructure development plan and report back to the new council in time for the annual plan with options. That just provides some room rather than instructs you to do one.
To consider. Yeah, no, that's good. I'm happy with that. Phil, you are as well? All right. And that gives us a bit of room to move so that we can get to a more positive outcome than just rejecting it outright.
And Mr. Chair, could you put 1 and 2 separately? Because I don't agree with that, but 3 is fine, obviously.
Put 1 and 2 separate. Okay, so I'll put 3 separately.
Yeah, thanks.
1 and 2 together. All right, great. All right. So I'll do exactly that. I'll put 1 and 2 together. All of those in favour say aye. Against? So the noes, if you can raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yep, so that's carried. And then I'm putting clause 3 separately. All those in favour say aye. Against? So that's carried.